The storm outside raged violently, a symphony of chaos against the glass walls of the penthouse. Lightning streaked across the night sky, illuminating the city below in sharp, fleeting flashes. The rain lashed against the windows like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry, the wind howling through the towering skyscrapers like an unrelenting whisper of fate. Inside, the atmosphere was just as turbulent. Alexander Gray stood motionless by the window, the half-filled whiskey glass trembling slightly in his grip. His reflection in the glass was a shadow of the man he had built himself to be, composed, invincible, unreadable. But tonight, the storm outside mirrored the one inside him. His piercing blue eyes, usually cold and calculated, were locked onto the woman standing in the middle of the room. Camilla Reed, the woman he had let into his world, the woman he had foolishly trusted, the woman who, in a single moment, had shattered everything. She stood frozen, arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold in a truth that had already slipped through her trembling lips. Her dark eyes were glassy with unshed tears, her chest rising and falling in unsteady breaths. Her voice had barely been louder than the rain when she whispered, "I never meant to fall in love with you." Alexander's jaw clenched, his knuckles white around the glass. He had spent years learning to control his emotions, to never let anyone see the cracks beneath his armor. But right now, it felt like the very foundation he had built his life upon was caving in beneath him. "But I can't do this anymore. I can't keep lying to you." The words echoed in his mind like a haunting melody, twisting like a knife into something deep inside him. His breath came slow and measured, masking the storm brewing in his chest. He took a deliberate step toward her, his voice dangerously calm. "Lying about what, Camilla?" She flinched, as if his voice itself was a force that could break her. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, her lips parting, but the words refused to come. "Say it. Give me a reason to hate you." The seconds stretched like an eternity before she finally lifted her gaze to meet his. Her eyes, those same eyes that had once looked at him with warmth, were now clouded with guilt. Then, as if saying the words would tear her apart, she whispered, "I was sent to destroy you." The world seemed to stop. The storm outside, the city's distant hum, even the steady beat of his own heart. It all faded into a suffocating silence. Alexander exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the glass before he suddenly flung it across the room. The crystal shattered against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the tension like a gunshot. Camilla flinched but didn't move. Alexander took another step forward, his gaze burning into hers. "Say that again." His voice was low, controlled, but beneath it, a war was raging. Camilla's lips trembled. She shut her eyes for a brief second, as if summoning the strength to face the storm she had unleashed. And then she said it again. "I was sent to destroy you." This time the words didn't just cut, they burned. Alexander's entire body stiffened, his pulse roaring in his ears. His mind raced, connecting the unspoken dots, unraveling every moment he had spent with her, every touch, every glance, every whisper shared in the dark. All of it, a lie. He wanted to feel anger. He wanted to feel rage. But all he felt was the unbearable weight of betrayal. Lightning flashed again, illuminating Camilla's face for a split second. The woman before him wasn't the woman he thought he knew. And yet, a part of him still wished she was. His voice dropped to a whisper, rough and raw. "Who sent you?" For the first time, a tear slipped down Camilla's cheek. She took a deep, shuddering breath. But before she could answer, the lights flickered, and the storm outside grew even louder. 6 months earlier, the prestigious Grand Monarch Hotel pulsed with elegance, a gathering of the city's elite under a canopy of dazzling chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of fine champagne and expensive cologne, murmurs of carefully calculated conversations weaving through the grand ballroom like an intricate dance. For Alexander Gray, this was nothing new. He had attended more of these events than he cared to count, each one a predictable display of power, alliances, and veiled intentions. As the CEO of Gray Enterprises, he was used to being the center of attention, whether people adored him or despised him. But tonight, he wasn't interested in the people vying for his acknowledgement. Tonight, his gaze was locked onto something, or rather someone, entirely different. Her. Across the vast room, just beyond the golden glow of the chandeliers, stood a woman unlike any he had ever seen. Alone, detached, untouched by the noise and excess around her. Dressed in a sleek black gown that accentuated every delicate curve, she stood by the balcony, her posture poised yet distant. Her dark eyes were lost in the view of the city, reflecting something unreadable. Pain, maybe, or a secret she didn't want the world to see. Alexander wasn't sure why, but he couldn't look away. Maybe it was the way she didn't pretend. Maybe it was the way she seemed out of place, yet completely in control. Or maybe it was the undeniable, unspoken pull between them. Without thinking, he moved toward her. The second he stepped onto the balcony, the noise of the party faded into the background. Only the cool night air and the city lights stretching endlessly below remained. A party this grand, and yet you look like you'd rather be anywhere else. She turned her head slightly, her lips curving into a small, guarded smile. Maybe I would. Her voice was smooth, almost effortless, yet there was something underneath. Something she wasn't saying. Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued. People rarely spoke to him like that. Usually, women at these events fell into two categories, either those who sought his power or those intimidated by it. But she was neither. She wasn't seeking his approval. She wasn't eager to impress him. She was simply there. That alone made her different. He tilted his head, watching her with newfound curiosity. Alexander Gray. She hesitated, just for a second, a barely noticeable flicker of something, before she composed herself again. Camilla? No last name. She didn't need to give one, because what neither of them knew at that moment was that their pasts were already intertwined. And this meeting? It was never meant to happen. Not like this, 5 months earlier. The first time Alexander kissed Camilla, he didn't expect it to mean anything. It was supposed to be a fleeting moment, just another chapter in his long, well-practiced game of attraction. A night that would burn bright and fade into memory like the many before. But he was wrong, because Camilla wasn't like the others. After that first meeting at the Grand Monarch Hotel, Alexander found himself running into Camilla far more often than coincidence should allow. First, at an art exhibition he had attended only out of obligation. Then, at an upscale charity gala where she sat at the far end of the hall, ignoring the crowd, stirring her wine absent-mindedly. And finally, at a private lounge, a place few people outside his world had access to. Each time, their conversations were effortless, sharp, teasing, layered. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't awed by his power. She challenged him. She made him curious. And for Alexander Gray, curiosity was a dangerous thing. The third time he saw her, he was already beginning to suspect she was more than just a passing presence in his life. It was a rainy night, the city streets glistening under golden lamplights as he exited a high-stakes business dinner. He had just gotten into his car when he saw her, standing across the street beneath the awning of a small bookstore. She was alone, not waiting for anyone, just standing there. Something about the way she looked at the rain, her face tilted up toward the sky, unbothered, lost in thought, completely detached from the world around her. It made him want to know more. And for a man like Alexander, wanting was a dangerous thing. Without hesitation, he told his driver to stop. "You have a habit of appearing where I least expect you," he said, stepping up beside her. Camilla didn't even flinch at his sudden presence. Instead, she exhaled softly, her lips curving into that knowing smile. "Funny," she mused, tilting her head. "I was just about to say the same about you." He smirked, his hands tucking into the pockets of his coat as he studied her. The way the city lights reflected in her dark eyes. The way her arms were folded across her chest, protecting herself from the cold. The way she still hadn't looked directly at him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Camilla hesitated, just for a second. Then, as if deciding it was safer to lie, she said, "Nothing." Alexander knew it wasn't the truth. Still, he didn't push. Instead, he reached for her hand, lifting it gently. Her skin was cold against his warmth. "You're freezing." Before she could respond, he unbuttoned his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was a small gesture, one he wouldn't have thought twice about. But when she looked up at him then, finally meeting his gaze, something in his chest tightened. Something unfamiliar. Something dangerous. That night, beneath the soft glow of city lights, Alexander Gray kissed Camilla Reed for the first time. And for the first time in his life, a kiss didn't feel like a game. After that night, everything changed. What was supposed to be a passing intrigue turned into something far deeper. Alexander found himself thinking about her when he shouldn't have been, wondering where she was, who she was with, what she was thinking when she wasn't speaking. And Camilla, she let him in, but only just enough. She was a puzzle, a maze that he was both desperate and terrified to solve. They met in secret. Late nights, empty lounges, quiet moments stolen between the chaos of their separate worlds. The way she spoke about the stars made him forget about boardrooms and power struggles. The way she brushed her fingers across his jaw when she thought he was asleep made something inside him ache. He didn't realize it then, but he was falling. And he wasn't the only one. Because Camilla Reed, the woman who was supposed to be his downfall, was falling too. Even when she knew she shouldn't. Even when she knew it was all a lie. One night, as they lay together in the dim glow of his penthouse, Camilla traced invisible patterns on his skin. "What is it?" Alexander asked, his voice quiet. She hesitated, then shook her head, smiling. "Nothing," she murmured, pressing a soft kiss against his jaw. But it wasn't nothing. Because what she wanted to say was, "What happens when you find out who I really am?" But she didn't. Because tonight she wanted to pretend. She wanted to pretend that this was real, that she wasn't keeping secrets, that she wasn't sent here to ruin him. Because, for the first time, Camilla wished she had met him under different circumstances. In another life, maybe. One where they weren't destined to destroy each other. 4 months earlier, Alexander Gray had built his empire on control. But Camilla Reed was the first person to make him feel out of control. And it was intoxicating. She had slipped into his world so effortlessly, becoming a fixture in his once carefully structured existence. Their meetings had turned from sporadic encounters into something she was in his penthouse more. She stole his time, made him forget the ruthless deadlines and power struggles. She was the first person he thought about in the morning, and the last thing on his mind at night. He hadn't planned for any of this, but Camilla had become inevitable. It happened one night. They had just returned from an evening drive along the coast, the cool air thick with the scent of salt and rain. Alexander watched her as she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, lost in thought. Her dark hair fell in soft waves down her back, the silk of his shirt draped over her frame. She looked at home. But something was off. It was subtle, a shift in her demeanor. The way she checked her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. The way she avoided his gaze just a second too long. Alexander wasn't a man easily deceived. He had spent his life reading people, predicting their betrayals before they even considered them. And yet, for the first time, he didn't want to believe what his instincts were telling him. But then, the text message changed everything. It was late, well past midnight. Camilla had fallen asleep beside him, her breathing slow and steady. Alexander had reached for her phone out of instinct when he heard it vibrate. An unconscious movement, a habit formed from years of always being aware. But when he saw the name on the screen, his entire body went cold. Henry Reed. The name of the man who had spent years trying to dismantle everything Alexander had built. The man who had nearly destroyed his father's legacy. The man who was responsible for the worst years of Alexander's life. Camilla shifted in her sleep, completely unaware that everything had just changed. For a long moment, Alexander simply stared at the name, the weight of realization pressing down on his chest. He felt his pulse in his throat, his mind racing. Camilla? Was a Reed? And worse, why was she still in contact with him? The next morning, Alexander said nothing. He woke up before Camilla, watching her as she lay beside him, the sunlight catching the curve of her cheek. She looked peaceful, innocent. And for the first time, he didn't know if what he felt for her was love or betrayal, but he had to know the truth. So he did what he did best. He investigated. It only took a day for his private investigator to get back to him, and what Alexander held in his hands that evening was a file that unraveled everything. Camilla Reed, daughter of Henry Reed, born into a world that had every reason to hate him, the same world that had tried to destroy him before. She had been in his bed, in his home, in his arms, and she had been lying to him all along. Alexander clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ached, his grip on the file so hard that the paper crumpled beneath his fingers. He wanted to storm back into his penthouse, demand the truth from her, make her say it to his face. But something held him back. Because despite everything, despite knowing what he now knew, he still wanted her. And that realization was the most dangerous of all. That night, when Alexander returned home, Camilla was waiting for him. She was curled up on the couch, wearing his sweater, reading a book as if nothing had changed, as if everything between them was still real. He stood in the doorway, watching her. She glanced up and smiled. "You're home late." Alexander's grip on the file in his hand tightened. He could hear the storm outside, wind rattling against the windows. He took a step forward, voice impossibly calm. "Tell me the truth, Camilla." Her expression flickered, but she recovered quickly. "About what?" His next words were deliberate, slow. "About who you really are." The air in the room shifted instantly. Camilla stilled, her fingers gripping the edge of her book just a little too tightly. Alexander watched her closely. "Don't lie to me," he said, voice dangerously low. Seconds passed. The storm outside roared, and then, finally, Camilla exhaled. She closed the book in her lap, her eyes meeting his. "How much do you already know?" There it was. No denial, no excuse, just the quiet acceptance of someone who knew the moment had finally come. Alexander took another step forward, his breath unsteady. "Enough. Present day." The penthouse. The storm outside raged like a reflection of the war within him. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the tension between them in harsh, unforgiving flashes. Alexander stood rigid in the center of the penthouse, his jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Camilla sat on the edge of the couch, her posture eerily calm. But he knew better. He could see the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her dress, the way her breathing had changed, the way her gaze flickered. Not with fear, but with something else. Guilt. How much do you already know? The words left her lips like a quiet surrender, but Alexander heard them like a gunshot. She wasn't denying it. She wasn't even trying to lie, and somehow that was worse. He took another step forward. Enough. His voice was low, steady, but beneath it there was something sharp, something dangerous. Camilla's lips parted, but she didn't speak right away. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her expression unreadable. Alexander clenched his fists. So it's true. Finally, she looked at him again, and the way she looked at him made something inside him ache. Yes. Silence fell between them. For a long moment, all Alexander could hear was the sound of the storm outside, the wind howling, the rain hammering against the windows, the distant rumble of thunder. He had expected rage. He had expected betrayal. He had expected her to fight, to explain, to defend herself. But she didn't. She just sat there, watching him, as if she had already accepted the worst. And that infuriated him. You lied to me. The words came out like a blade. From the very beginning. Camilla swallowed hard, but she didn't look away. Yes. Alexander let out a sharp, bitter laugh. That's all you have to say? She hesitated. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she said, I never meant to hurt you. His jaw clenched. You expect me to believe that? Her gaze flickered with something unreadable. I don't expect anything. Alexander exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. He needed to think. He needed to breathe. But he couldn't. Because every time he looked at her, he remembered everything. The late-night conversations, the stolen kisses, the way she had fit into his world so effortlessly, the way he had let his guard down for her, the way she made him believe she was real. He took a slow, deliberate step closer. Was it all a game to you? Camilla's breath hitched, and for the first time she looked like she might break. She shook her head. No, he didn't believe her. And yet, he did. And that was the worst part. Camilla stood slowly, her fingers trembling as she reached for him, but stopped herself. I was supposed to destroy you, she admitted, her voice raw with pain. My father, he gave me no choice. He wanted revenge, and She swallowed hard. I agreed. I was supposed to get close to you, gain your trust, find a way to bring you down. Alexander's breathing slowed. He should have expected it. But hearing it from her own lips, it was like drowning. I hated you before I met you, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I knew who you were. She let out a broken laugh, shaking her head. But then I got to know you, and suddenly, everything I thought I believed, it didn't make sense anymore. Alexander's eyes darkened. And yet, you still stayed. Her lips trembled. Because I fell in love with you. The words hung between them, electric and fragile. Alexander scoffed, shaking his head. Love? His voice was bitter, sharp. You call this love? Camilla's eyes glistened with something unsaid. I tried to leave, she admitted, stepping closer. So many times. But I couldn't. She looked up at him then, and for the first time she looked truly vulnerable. I couldn't walk away from you, she whispered. Because for the first time in my life, I found something real. Then why lie to me? His voice cracked, the anger in his chest warring with something deeper, something more painful. Tears welled in Camilla's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Because I was afraid that if I told you the truth, you'd never look at me the same way again. Her voice broke on the last word. And that was when Alexander realized. She had never stopped lying, because even now she was still lying to herself. Alexander stood motionless, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had spent his entire life preparing for betrayal. He had trained himself to anticipate it, to expect it, to never let it break him. But this was breaking him. Camilla watched him, waiting for him to decide whether she was worth forgiving. She had played him. She had lied to him. She had been sent to ruin him. And yet, despite everything, his body still ached for her. His heart still wanted her. And he hated himself for it. Finally, Alexander inhaled sharply, stepping back. Camilla's breath caught. "Alexander." His voice was low and cold. "I need you to leave." She stilled, and in that moment he saw it, the way her heart broke before she even turned away. She nodded slowly, taking a shaky breath. Then, without another word, she walked past him, disappearing into the storm. Alexander let her go, but as he listened to the sound of the door closing behind her, he knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. 3 days later, Camilla was gone. No note, no explanation, just gone. Alexander had expected it. He had given her an out, told her to leave, and she had. He should have felt relief. He should have felt anger. But all he felt was an unbearable, suffocating emptiness. The penthouse felt colder without her. Quieter. Alexander never noticed how much space she had taken up until she wasn't there. Her perfume had faded from the sheets. Her favorite book no longer sat on the coffee table. Her voice no longer filled the silence with warmth he hadn't known he needed. And that was the problem. Because Alexander Gray didn't need anyone. At least, that's what he told himself. But as weeks turned to months, the lie became harder to believe. Because she was still there, in his mind, in his memories, in the hollow ache that wouldn't leave him. No amount of work, no distraction, no vice could erase her from his thoughts. And that was unacceptable. So he did what he did best. He searched for her. At first it was subtle, a call to his private investigator, a quiet inquiry at the airports, checking flight records, a careful scan of the properties she could have run to. But Camilla Reed was nowhere. She had disappeared without a trace. For the first time in years, Alexander felt powerless, and he hated it. Hated that she had been the one to leave. Hated that she had slipped through his fingers. Hated that despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal, he still wanted to find her. But when 6 months passed, and she was still nowhere to be found, Alexander forced himself to stop looking. If she wanted to be a ghost, so be it. And yet, fate had other plans. It happened by accident. Alexander had traveled to a quiet seaside town, looking into an investment project that should have meant nothing. It was supposed to be another business trip, another deal, another move forward. Until he saw her. Camilla. Sitting at a small cafe by the ocean, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, completely unaware that her past had caught up to her. Alexander's entire body froze. For a second, he thought he was imagining it. But then she shifted, and he saw it. The soft glow of her skin, the familiar curve of her lips, the way the wind played with her dark hair. It was her. His pulse hammered in his ears, anger and longing colliding inside him in a way he wasn't prepared for. But then, his eyes drifted to the small figure sitting beside her. A child. Tiny hands wrapped around a warm mug, dark, unruly hair, and piercing blue eyes. His eyes. Alexander couldn't breathe. The world tilted, and in that moment everything changed. Camilla lifted her gaze, and the second she saw him, she knew. The color drained from her face. Her breath hitched. Her hands shook around the coffee cup, as if she had just been caught in the one nightmare she had prayed would never come true. Because there was no escaping him now. She knew it, and so did he. Alexander took a step forward. Camilla's body went rigid, her protective instincts kicking in immediately as she placed a hand on the child's back. His child. His son. Alexander's voice came out low, unsteady, dangerous. You ran from me. Camilla swallowed hard, her lips parting like she wanted to speak. But no words came out. Alexander's hands curled into fists at his sides. The betrayal he had felt before was nothing compared to what he felt now. She had left. She had disappeared. She had taken his child. For the first time, Camilla Reed had done the one thing he could never forgive. She had kept him from something he never even knew he had. Camilla slowly stood, her eyes wide, filled with guilt, fear, and something else. She was bracing herself for his rage, for his judgment, for the storm she knew was about to hit. But Alexander didn't speak. He couldn't, because all he could do was look at the small boy, the child who was undeniably, irrevocably his. The child he never knew existed. The child she had stolen from him. His jaw tightened. His voice was ice. Tell me his name. Camilla hesitated. For a moment, Alexander thought she might not answer. But then, in a voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the crashing waves behind her, she whispered, Elias. The name hit Alexander like a punch to the chest. His gaze flickered back to the boy, his son, his heir, the child who had been living a life he was never supposed to know about. The child Camilla had tried to keep hidden. Alexander took another step forward. Camilla instinctively moved in front of Elias, shielding him. That single movement set something off inside him. Because that was all the proof he needed. She wasn't just afraid of his anger. She was afraid of losing control, losing Elias, losing him. And that meant he still had power over her. That meant she still cared. Alexander exhaled, his expression unreadable. Pack your things, Camilla. Her eyes widened. What? His voice was final, uncompromising, absolute. You're coming home. Camilla's breath caught. Alexander. His gaze burned into hers, his tone dangerously soft. Did you really think you could hide from me forever? Camilla's lips parted, her hands tightening at her sides. I won't let you take him from me. Alexander's smirk was slow, lethal. You already did that to me. A flicker of guilt passed through her eyes, but she held her ground. Alexander took another step, his voice lowering. We're not done, Camilla. Her heartbeat thundered against her ribs, because deep down, she knew he was right. The waves crashed gently against the shore, a rhythmic lullaby that had once brought her peace. But today, the ocean felt different, like a warning. Camilla sat at the small cafe on the edge of the seaside town, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, trying to believe in the quiet life she had built here. The sun was warm against her skin, and Elias, her little boy, giggled beside her as he stacked sugar packets into a tiny tower. She had thought she was safe. She had thought she had outrun her past, but the moment she lifted her gaze, she knew she had been wrong. The air stilled the moment their eyes met. Alexander Gray stood just a few feet away, like a phantom she had spent years running from. Tall, unshaken, dressed in black, as if he had stepped straight out of her nightmares. But his expression wasn't one of rage. It was worse. Because he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Elias, the small boy with piercing blue eyes. Alexander's eyes. Camilla's fingers turned ice cold against the ceramic mug. Her lungs tightened. Her heart stopped. Alexander had found them, and there was no escaping him now. He moved toward them with slow, deliberate steps, his gaze never leaving her. Camilla felt every instinct scream at her to run. But where? There was nowhere left to go. The moment he reached her table, she saw it. The storm raging behind his eyes. A storm that had been brewing for years. "You ran from me," he murmured, his voice a quiet accusation. Camilla swallowed hard. "Alexander." His eyes flickered to Elias again, and she saw the exact moment realization crashed over him. Because there was no denying it now. This wasn't just a boy, this was his son. His jaw clenched. "How long?" The words were like a knife, slicing through the fragile space between them. She wanted to lie. She wanted to turn away. But what was the point? He already knew. Her silence was the only answer he needed. The coffee had become too small, too suffocating. Elias was still playing, blissfully unaware of the war unfolding around him. Alexander inhaled deeply, as if trying to contain the storm threatening to consume him whole. "I let you go," he whispered, his voice almost shaking. "And you took my child with you." Camilla's chest tightened. He wasn't just angry, he was shattered. And it hurt more than she expected. "I had to," she said, voice barely above a breath. A bitter laugh left his lips. "You had to?" He shook his head, his gaze burning into her like fire. "You don't get to say that," he said quietly. "You don't get to decide what's best for me." Her hands trembled under the weight of his words. "You weren't supposed to know," she whispered. "I never wanted—" "What?" His voice was sharp now. "You never wanted me to find out? You never wanted me to know I had a son?" His fists clenched at his sides, his entire body coiled like a predator ready to strike. Camilla's throat was dry. "I did what I thought was right," she murmured. His laughter was cold, hollow. "No, Camilla, you did what was easiest." And the worst part? He wasn't wrong. Alexander took another step closer, and suddenly, the cafe no longer felt like a safe place. Camilla's body instinctively shifted in front of Elias, shielding him. Alexander noticed. His expression hardened. "Are you seriously protecting him from me?" She inhaled sharply. "I'm protecting him from what comes next." Silence stretched between them. Heavy, unforgiving. Finally he exhaled slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, but laced with quiet devastation. "I would have given him everything," he said. "I would have given him the world." Camilla's eyes burned. She had spent years convincing herself that she had done the right thing. But now, standing in front of Alexander, watching the grief in his eyes, she wondered. Had she just been convincing herself of a lie? Alexander's expression shifted. Cold. Unyielding. "You have two choices," he said finally. Camilla stiffened. "Don't do this," he ignored her. "Choice one," he said, voice even. "You come back with me. We raise him together." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "And choice two?" she whispered. Alexander's blue eyes turned to ice. "I take you to court." Her breath caught. Her stomach dropped. "And I will win." She knew it wasn't an empty threat. Alexander Gray didn't lose ever. Camilla turned back to Elias, her heart breaking. He was playing with his hands, his small legs swinging beneath the table, completely unaware that his world was about to change. And in that moment, she knew. She couldn't fight Alexander. She wouldn't. Because if she did, he wouldn't just take Elias. He would destroy her. She swallowed back the lump in her throat, turned back to Alexander, and whispered the one word that sealed her fate. "Fine." Alexander said nothing at first, but she saw it, the way his shoulders relaxed slightly, the way his breath came just a little easier, because he had won. But as he looked at her, something flickered in his expression, something almost uncertain. Because despite everything, despite the battle they were about to face, he still wanted her. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The city skyline stretched endlessly before her, the world she had once escaped now pulling her back in. Camilla stood on the penthouse balcony, the crisp night air brushing against her skin. Behind her, Elias slept peacefully in the room Alexander had prepared, a room that made it clear their son would never be without a father again. She felt his presence before he even spoke. "You think about running again, don't you?" Alexander's voice was quiet, steady. She exhaled slowly, gripping the railing. "Every day." He moved closer, stopping just behind her, his warmth pressing against her back. "Then why haven't you?" She turned to face him, her dark eyes searching his. "Because this time, you'd come after me." A slow smirk tugged at his lips. "Damn right I would." A bitter laugh escaped her, but there was something else behind it, acceptance. Because Alexander Gray was inevitable, just like the storm that had once threatened to tear them apart. He was also the only man who could ever make her feel whole again. She stepped closer, closing the last bit of space between them. And this time, she didn't run. The end.